Ladies and gentlemen, in a land ruled by chaos and guns, a few brave men stood between lawlessness and order. These were the Wild West lawmen, legends who shaped history with their courage and conviction. Wyatt Earp stands as one of the most enduring figures of the American Wild West, not because he sought fame, but because his actions captured the imagination of generations. Born in 1848 in Monmouth, Illinois, Earp ventured westward during a time when America was expanding rapidly and the rule of law was struggling to keep pace. His journey through towns like Wichita, Dodge City, and eventually Tombstone was marked by a series of law enforcement roles that thrust him into the heart of frontier justice. Unlike the traditional image of a wild gunslinger, Earp was known for his reserved, methodical nature. He didn't drink heavily, rarely gambled recklessly, and preferred to settle disputes with a show of authority rather than immediate violence. But make no mistake, when the situation called for it, Earp could be deadly. His calm under pressure and willingness to face down some of the most dangerous men in the West made him a man to be feared and respected. His most famous moment came on October 26, 1881, in Tombstone, Arizona, during the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral. Alongside his brothers Virgil and Morgan, and his close friend Doc Holliday, Earp faced off against the outlaw Cowboys gang. The shootout, lasting barely 30 seconds, cemented his place in Western lore. Though he was not the acting lawman during the fight, his brother Virgil was the city marshal. It was Wyatt who took charge when things turned violent, leading the charge and walking away unscathed. But the OK Corral was just one chapter in a long and complicated life. Earp's law career spanned decades, and he often operated in the gray areas of justice. At times, he was accused of being heavy-handed or acting outside the bounds of the law. Yet, to many towns on the brink of lawlessness, men like Earp were exactly what was needed, a figure who could impose order in the face of chaos. Beyond the badges and gunfights, Wyatt Earp symbolized something deeper, the struggle to enforce justice in a world where rules were often written in blood. Whether viewed as a hero, an anti-hero, or something in between, his name became synonymous with the very idea of frontier law. Bat Masterson was not the kind of lawman who relied on brute force or theatrical violence to make a name for himself. Instead, he was calculated, composed, and deeply intelligent, qualities that set him apart from many of his more hot-headed contemporaries. Born William Barclay Masterson in 1853 in Canada, he grew up in the American frontier during a time of violent change. By the time he was in his 20s, Masterson had already earned a reputation as a skilled scout and marksman, with experience fighting in the Indian Wars and buffalo hunting on the Great Plains. He began his law enforcement career in the booming cattle town of Dodge City, Kansas, where chaos reigned. Cowboys poured in with their cattle drives, filling the town with drinking, gambling, and gunfights. Dodge City needed a stabilizing force, and Bat Masterson proved to be exactly that. As a sheriff of Ford County, he earned respect not through fear, but through fairness, cool judgment, and tactical thinking. He was not quick to draw his weapon. He preferred resolving conflict through diplomacy and strategic pressure, but when the time came to use force, he did so with precision. Masterson's career overlapped with other famous lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Charlie Bassett. In fact, Earp and Masterson often worked together in Dodge City, forming a bond that extended beyond law enforcement. Their partnership reflected a professional respect rooted in shared values, discipline, courage, and an understanding that the law must be upheld, even in places where the law barely existed. What made Bat Masterson particularly fascinating was his life after the badge. Unlike many lawmen who faded into obscurity or died young, Masterson reinvented himself. He moved east to New York City and became a sports writer and columnist, penning articles for the New York Morning Telegraph. There, he rubbed shoulders with celebrities, athletes, and even U.S. presidents. Despite being far from the dusty streets of the West, his words still carried the grit and wisdom of someone who had walked through fire and come out stronger. His ability to transition from the unpredictable violence of the frontier to the structured world of journalism demonstrated the depth of his intellect. He understood not only how to manage lawlessness, but also how to tell the stories of those lawless times to a new, urban America that was eager to mythologize the Old West. Masterson's calm demeanor, sharp mind, and adaptability made him a unique figure among the lawmen of the Wild West, a strategist in a time of gunslingers, a writer in a land of warriors. Wild Bill Hickok was a man who seemed larger than life, even in his own time. Born James Butler Hickok in 1837 in Homer, Illinois, he would become one of the most flamboyant and enigmatic lawmen of the American frontier. With his long flowing hair, finely tailored clothing, and piercing blue eyes, Hickok looked like he had stepped straight out of a dime novel, and in many ways, he had. But behind the legend was a complex figure whose life blended law, violence, tragedy, and showmanship in equal measure. Hickok's reputation as a deadly marksman was earned early. During the Civil War, he served as a scout and spy for the Union Army, using both his sharpshooting skills and his cunning to gain intelligence behind enemy lines. After the war, he drifted into roles as a lawman, gambler, and professional gunfighter, taking jobs as town marshal in frontier towns such as Hays City and Abilene, Kansas, towns known for their dangerous streets and overflowing saloons. As a marshal, Hickok enforced the law with a cold precision. He was not a man to be trifled with. His aim was so well known that many claimed he could shoot a man squarely between the eyes without blinking. Numerous accounts speak of him facing down armed men without flinching, using his twin Colt Navy revolvers to end conflicts in seconds. But Hickok was not reckless. He often tried to de-escalate situations first, resorting to violence only when absolutely necessary. One of the things that set Wild Bill apart from many other lawmen was his awareness of the weight his reputation carried. He knew he was being watched, written about, and mythologized even in his lifetime. He gave interviews, posed for photographs, and embraced the theatricality that came with his fame. Yet, this fame was a double-edged sword. It drew challengers, young gunslingers hoping to make their name by killing the great Wild Bill. It also bred paranoia, and Hickok, though proud and confident in his abilities, often sat with his back to the wall in saloons, always watching. In his later years, Hickok struggled to find steady work as towns grew quieter and his usefulness as a lawman faded. He turned increasingly to gambling, drifting westward to Deadwood in the Dakota Territory. It was there, in 1876, that his life ended abruptly. While playing poker in a saloon, he was shot in the back of the head by Jack McCall, a petty drifter seeking revenge or fame, depending on the story. At the time of his death, Hickok was holding two pairs, aces and eights, forever remembered as the dead man's hand. Though he lived a life of danger and conflict, Wild Bill Hickok also carried a certain melancholy. He was a man haunted by the violence he'd committed, shaped by the violent era in which he lived. Friends and witnesses described a quiet, reflective side to him, a stark contrast to the gunslinging legend. He was not just a killer. He was a symbol of the contradictions of the American frontier: bravery and brutality, justice and vengeance, myth and man. Reeves stands as one of the most remarkable and often overlooked figures in the history of the American West. Born into slavery in 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas, Reeves' life defied every limitation placed on him by society. His journey from enslaved child to one of the most formidable U.S. deputy marshals in American history is not just a story of personal triumph. It's a narrative that reshapes how we view law and order in the Wild West. During the Civil War, Reeves escaped from bondage in the Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, seeking refuge among the Native American tribes, primarily the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole. During his years in hiding, he learned several native languages, developed advanced tracking skills, and became an expert horseman and marksman. These years of survival and self-reliance would later become the foundation for his extraordinary career in law enforcement. In 1875, after the war ended and slavery was abolished, Reeves was recruited by U.S. Marshal James Fagan as one of the first black deputy marshals west of the Mississippi River. He was tasked with bringing law and order to the chaotic and often deadly Indian Territory, an area teeming with outlaws, fugitives, and renegade gangs who believed they were beyond the reach of justice. For Reeves, that belief only made the pursuit more determined. Over the course of his career, Reeves is estimated to have arrested more than 3,000 criminals, a staggering number by any measure. He brought in murderers, horse thieves, bootleggers, and bandits, often single-handedly, and under the most dangerous conditions. What made his accomplishments even more astounding was that he operated in an era when racial prejudice and systemic racism were deeply entrenched. Yet, Reeves commanded respect from all quarters. Even hardened criminals feared and admired his discipline, bravery, and refusal to compromise with lawbreakers. Reeves was also known for his strict personal code. He did not drink or gamble, and he was deeply religious, often quoting scripture to the criminals he arrested. He never shot to kill unless absolutely necessary, but when violence erupted, he was unmatched with his Colt revolvers. One of the most extraordinary aspects of his life was his devotion to justice, even when it struck close to home. In one of the most difficult episodes of his career, Reeves arrested his own son, who had been charged with murder. That decision, heart-wrenching but principled, showed the depth of his commitment to the law above all else. Beyond his physical skills and moral compass, Bass Reeves was a master of disguise. He would often adopt false identities, posing as a cowboy, a farmer, or even an outlaw himself, to infiltrate enemy camps and gather critical information. These tactics made him nearly impossible to outwit. Many of the criminals he apprehended were caught completely off guard, realizing too late that the humble stranger in their midst was, in fact, the legendary Bass Reeves. Despite his unmatched record and undeniable courage, Reeves never received the same widespread recognition as white lawmen of his era, like Wyatt Earp or Wild Bill Hickok. His story was largely left out of early Western history books, hidden behind a veil of racial bias and selective memory. But in recent decades, historians and storytellers have begun to uncover the truth. That Bass Reeves was not just an exceptional lawman. He was one of the greatest to ever wear a badge on the American frontier. The American Wild West in the late 19th century was a region defined by opportunity, expansion, and chaos. As settlers moved westward in search of land, gold, and a better life, they left behind the structures of the more established eastern states. What replaced them, especially in the early days of frontier towns, was a volatile mix of ambition, desperation, and violence. Towns sprang up almost overnight near railroads, mining operations, or cattle trails, but laws, judges, and peacekeepers lagged far behind. In this vacuum, lawlessness thrived. Without consistent legal institutions or reliable enforcement, disputes that would have been resolved through courts or contracts elsewhere were often settled with fists, knives, or guns. Property theft, drunken brawls, gambling disputes, and deadly feuds were everyday occurrences. Outlaws and desperados such as Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Butch Cassidy found fame and infamy in this lawless frontier. Many of these criminals saw themselves not as villains, but as products, or even champions, of a society without rules. The towns themselves, like Deadwood, Dodge City, Tombstone, and Abilene, became notorious for their wild saloons, brothels, and gambling dens. Violence often erupted over cheating at cards, unpaid debts, or personal grudges. Gunfights weren't just the stuff of legend. They were very real, and sometimes happened in broad daylight on dusty main streets. The average life expectancy for a lawman, or even a regular citizen in some of these boomtowns, could be shockingly low. In such a volatile atmosphere, lawmen had to make swift decisions with life or death consequences. There were often no backup officers, no forensic science, and little legal oversight. A single sheriff or marshal might be the only representative of the law for hundreds of square miles. These men had to know the terrain, the people, and the criminal tactics of the time. They had to be part diplomat, part tracker, part soldier, and sometimes part executioner. Many towns relied on vigilante justice in the absence of formal courts, and justice was often dealt out by lynch mobs or makeshift tribunals. While some of these vigilante actions were aimed at protecting innocent settlers, others were driven by racism, greed, or personal vendettas. The danger was not just from outlaws, but from the arbitrary and inconsistent application of justice itself. Adding to the disorder were the conflicting jurisdictions between local sheriffs, federal marshals, tribal lands, and military outposts. A criminal could flee one area and be immune from pursuit in another simply due to legal gray zones. Bandits often exploited these gaps in authority, vanishing into the hills, across borders, or into reservations where white law enforcement had little reach. The lawlessness of the Wild West wasn't just the backdrop for legendary gunfights. It was the central challenge that defined the era. Every lawman who wore a badge in that time had to confront it directly, knowing full well that the next day, or even the next hour, could bring a showdown that would test not only their skills, but their very resolve. The stakes were always high, and justice was rarely simple. Being a lawman in the Wild West wasn't just a profession, it was a dangerous, often soul-consuming way of life. Far from the romanticized image portrayed in Western films, the real men who wore the badge walked a razor's edge between order and anarchy, life and sudden death. Every day they faced threats not only from armed criminals, but also from the unforgiving wilderness, political corruption, and even the very citizens they were sworn to protect. One of the most immediate dangers was the unpredictability of the people they encountered. Lawmen dealt with hardened outlaws, fugitives, and desperate drifters who had little to lose. These were individuals who would not hesitate to draw their guns at the slightest provocation. Many towns were flooded with alcohol, firearms, and personal grudges, a toxic combination that made violence an everyday reality. The line between a routine arrest and a fatal shootout was frighteningly thin. Lawmen had to be constantly alert, always watching for the flick of a wrist or a subtle move toward a holster. The threat of being ambushed was ever present. Lawmen often had bounties placed on their heads, especially if they were known for bringing in notorious criminals. Many lived with the knowledge that at any moment, they could be gunned down from behind while walking the street, eating dinner, or even sleeping. Some, like Wild Bill Hickok, were killed in such moments of temporary peace, shot in the back without warning. Others were hunted down in revenge killings by gang members or family members of those they had arrested. Beyond the physical dangers, there were emotional and psychological tolls. The pressure of making life-and-death decisions weighed heavily on many lawmen. They had to deal with the aftermath of shootouts, the grief of widowed families, and the guilt of decisions that didn't always feel just. The job often isolated them from the rest of the community. People might respect them, but they also feared them. Friendship was rare, and trust was even rarer. Some lawmen became hardened and emotionally distant, while others turned to alcohol or gambling as a way to cope with the constant stress. The demands of the job also exacted a toll on family life, if they had one at all. A wife and children could be both a comfort and a liability. Outlaws might target a lawman's family to send a message or seek revenge. Many chose to remain unmarried or live solitary lives to avoid exposing loved ones to danger. For those who did have families, the fear of leaving them behind was a constant shadow. Each day on duty could be their last. Financially, the job offered little reward. Frontier lawmen were often poorly paid and under-equipped. They had to buy their own weapons, horses, and ammunition. If they were injured in the line of duty, there was usually no pension or medical support. Many died penniless, buried in unmarked graves or forgotten by the very communities they helped to protect. Despite all of this, countless men still chose the badge. Whether driven by a sense of justice, a desire for order, or the sheer thrill of the hunt, they faced impossible odds with courage that bordered on recklessness. Their sacrifices, often overlooked, were the price paid for the eventual taming of the West, a land that demanded everything from those who dared to bring it under the rule of Lawin, the lawless expanse of the Wild West. Justice was rarely black and white. Frontier lawmen lived in a moral gray zone, where right and wrong were often decided in the heat of the moment, far removed from the structured courtrooms and legal standards of the eastern states. These men were tasked with enforcing order in a landscape where laws were vague, authority was contested, and survival sometimes depended on quick and deadly decisions. As a result, many lawmen blurred the line between hero and executioner, protector and predator. What complicated matters further was the absence of consistent oversight. Most lawmen operated independently or with minimal supervision, especially in remote towns or territories. With little to no formal training and often relying on instinct, reputation, and force of personality, they had to judge situations on the fly. This meant that justice could vary wildly depending on the individual. What one marshal might overlook, another might execute someone for. And in many cases, public opinion played as much a role as the law itself. Some of the most iconic lawmen of the era had personal histories that included gambling, bar fights, duels, and even alleged criminal behavior. Wyatt Earp, for example, is often remembered as a fearless lawman at the OK Corral, but he also had a past littered with accusations of horse theft, illegal gambling, and vigilante justice. Wild Bill Hickok was hailed as a heroic marshal, yet he killed numerous men in gunfights, some of which were later debated as unnecessary or even provoked. These contradictions make it difficult to draw a clear line between justice served and justice abused. Even Reeves, one of the most principled and respected figures of frontier law enforcement, operated in a system that was often racially biased, deeply flawed, and prone to extrajudicial decisions. His commitment to arresting wrongdoers, including his own son, speaks volumes about his character, but it also highlights the painful and complex choices lawmen faced in a world where personal loyalty and moral duty often collided. The legal system of the frontier allowed for, and sometimes even encouraged, harsh retribution. Wanted, dead, or alive, posters gave lawmen the license to shoot first and ask questions later. Trials were often hasty, lacking due process, and carried out with the assumption of guilt. In this context, lawmen wielded incredible power that could be used to protect or to punish, depending on who was holding the badge. There were also times when lawmen themselves resorted to vigilantism. Frustrated by legal loopholes, corrupt judges, or outlaw gangs that escaped punishment, some took matters into their own hands. They formed posses, raided hideouts, or even executed criminals without trial. These acts were sometimes applauded by local citizens, especially in towns where fear had paralyzed the community. But they also raised troubling questions about the boundaries of justice, and whether lawmen had truly risen above the violence they were supposed to stop. This ambiguity was further deepened by the media of the time. Dime novels, local newspapers, and traveling storytellers often exaggerated or romanticized the deeds of lawmen, turning flawed individuals into near-mythical figures. These tales often ignored the moral complexity of their actions, glossing over extrajudicial killings or personal vendettas in favor of a more heroic narrative. The public consumed these stories eagerly, shaping a national mythology that still persists today, but that mythology often failed to tell the whole truth. Justice in the Wild West was not just about enforcing laws. It was about imposing order on chaos, often through force and fear. And those who wore the badge had to decide, day by day, how far they were willing to go to keep that order intact, even if it meant sacrificing their own humanity along the way. The lawmen of the Wild West, such as Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, and Reeves, have left an indelible mark not only on the history of the American frontier, but also on the cultural imagination of the United States and the world. Their lives, filled with bravery, conflict, and controversy, helped shape the enduring myth of the American West, a myth that continues to influence how people understand justice, freedom, and heroism. These men became symbols of a time when America was still defining itself, a period of expansion and turmoil that tested the nation's values. The frontier lawmen embodied the idea of rugged individualism, the notion that one person, armed with a strong sense of justice and a steady hand, could impose order on a wild, lawless land. This image captured the public's imagination during a time when the country was rapidly modernizing and urbanizing, offering a nostalgic vision of simpler, more direct forms of justice. Their stories were popularized through dime novels, newspapers, and later, films and television shows, which often blended fact with fiction to create larger-than-life characters. Wyatt Earp's legendary gunfight at the OK Corral, for example, has been retold countless times, becoming a symbol of law versus chaos. Wild Bill Hickok's Dead Man's Hand and mysterious death added a layer of tragedy and romance to the tale of frontier justice. Reeves, once a hidden figure in history due to racial biases, is now gaining recognition as one of the most effective and respected lawmen of his era, challenging traditional narratives and expanding the scope of who is remembered in Western lore. The legacy of these lawmen also extends into the legal and cultural fabric of the United States. Their efforts helped lay the groundwork for modern law enforcement in the West, transitioning frontier towns from violent outposts into structured communities governed by rule of law. The challenges they faced, corruption, jurisdictional conflicts, and the need to adapt to diverse and rapidly changing populations mirror issues still relevant in contemporary policing and justice systems. However, their legacy is not without controversy. The myth of the Wild West lawmen often glosses over the harsher realities of their methods and the impact on indigenous peoples, minorities, and women. These figures sometimes operated with impunity, enforcing laws that were themselves products of a colonial and expansionist era. As such, modern historians and cultural critics continue to re-examine their stories, seeking a more nuanced understanding that acknowledges both their heroism and their flaws. In popular culture, the archetype of the Western lawman remains powerful. Characters inspired by these historical figures appear in novels, movies, and video games, symbolizing the complex intersection of justice, morality, and survival. Their stories invite audiences to explore fundamental questions about law and order, the use of violence, and what it means to be a protector in a world without clear rules. Ultimately, the Wild West lawmen have become part of the American identity, a testament to the nation's turbulent past and its ongoing struggle to balance freedom with responsibility. Their legacy challenges us to look beyond the myths and legends, to understand the real men behind the badges and the world they tried to tame, often at great personal cost. In the end, the stories of Wyatt Earp, Reeves, and their fellow lawmen remind us that the Wild West was more than just gunfights and dusty streets. It was a complex and often brutal struggle to establish justice in a land where chaos reigned. These men, with all their flaws and virtues, helped shape the very foundation of law enforcement in America. Their courage, sacrifices, and the difficult choices they made continue to inspire and provoke reflection on the nature of justice itself. As we look back on their legacies, we gain a deeper understanding of how far the American frontier, and the country as a whole, has come. Yet, their stories also serve as a timeless reminder that the pursuit of justice is never easy, and that true lawmen are defined not just by their badges or their guns, but by their unwavering commitment to uphold what is right, even in the face of overwhelming odds.